Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know it's tempting to get into the usual partisan food fight and score points. I'm going to use my precious 5 minutes that I had with someone as esteemed as you for perhaps a better purpose. And I'm struck, Mr. Swagel, that whenever I'm with colleagues of mine, fellow parliamentarians from around the world, especially in Europe, obviously right now the Russian invasion and attack on Ukraine is paramount. But a close second to that is every one of my colleagues is speaking about the inflation going on in their country. It is pretty much a worldwide issue, so hardly something we're dealing with in the US. So I was wondering if you could take a step back and maybe just give us the lay of the land internationally and especially in other Western democracies at what inflation looks like for those countries.
Okay, no, very good. And I can speak to that. And that affects the US because the condition of foreign countries affects us, both China, the lockdowns there, and what it does to our supply side, and then demand in other countries for U.S. exports.
Right.
So other countries are suffering from some of the same factors as we are. And I talked about earlier the Ukraine-related shock on food and energy, and of course Europe is much more affected by the negative effects of the energy shock there. So inflation has risen for all countries. For the U.S., the U.S. is first. So it does look like we had something different last year. The combination of the supply issues in the U.S. and the demand in the U.S. it made us go first. And so, that is a factor. And more recently, all countries are facing similar challenges together.
Yeah, my Belgian colleagues tell me theirs is over 8%. A French parliamentarian who I'm friends with, I think, pegged it at 7.5%. So obviously this is a challenge worldwide. Do you think one of the lessons coming out of COVID is, well, you'll see this is a bit of a leading question, but something I've been pushing for a number of years now is to increase domestic manufacturing, both for economic reasons, but also in terms of our national security. Do you believe now that coming out of the COVID experience, the argument for that is strengthened? And maybe you could even talk about some other critical parts of our supply chain that we now realize are really at risk, and COVID helped expose that.
Right. I can talk about a couple of dimensions, and of course, there's many dimensions to this. It's almost the closer you get to it, the more dimensions there are. It's fractal, I think is the word for that. And so we've seen the supply chain issues that have bedeviled the U.S. economy even from the very beginning of the pandemic. And of course, items produced in the U.S., those supply chains have been more resilient. But even there, the labor, issues with the labor supply have affected the U.S. I think we all understand now the impact of some of the critical supply chains, like in medicine and other critical issues, relying on foreign countries is difficult. And of course, not every foreign country is the same. So there is an important discussion to be had there about our trade alliances. And then lastly, obviously, what's happening with infant formula, right? There's ample supply, global supplies of safe and nutritious formula. It's the U.S. that, in some sense, we have inflicted the problem on ourselves. And so it's it's just a different wrinkle in the supply chain. And so absolutely, it's coming out of the pandemic. I think we all understand we need to focus on this more. It has an economic impact, a fiscal impact, and of course, an impact on families.
Yeah. One thing in speaking to a pretty prominent economist, Ian Stevenson, he believes that inflation is going to be a challenge for the rest of the year, beginning to come down next spring. And once it dropping pretty precipitously. You talked about this way back in the beginning, but I was wondering if you could just kind of offer your thoughts on that timetable, where you agree, disagree.
Yeah, so we have the supply issues facing the country generally waning over the course of this year. I talked, I think, earlier about the labor supply. That's one. We see some of the trade supply issues. The situation at some of the key U.S. ports looks to be getting better. The China lockdowns don't yet seem to be affecting their exports too much. So that is supporting our expectation that inflationary pressures will diminish over the course of the year. And then, of course, as we've discussed a couple of times, the demand side pressures driving inflation will diminish as well, both from what the Fed is doing and from fiscal policy, the pandemic spending falling away.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.